It's my pleasure now to invite Chief Superintendent Dennis Daly. He is the Director General, Criminal Operation and Community Aboriginal Policing. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today alongside my colleagues to discuss the Royal Canadian Mounted Police enforcement role in relation to Bill C-45, the proposed Cannabis Act. I am Chief Superintendent responsible for the RCMP's Contract Aboriginal Policing Services National Criminal Operations Section, and my colleague, Superintendent Yves Goupil, Director of Serious and Organized Crime in the RCMP's Federal Policing Services. I'd also like to recognize Sergeant Ray Moose, the RCMP National Drug Recognition Expert Coordinator. Combating organized crime has been a long-standing priority for the RCMP and the RCMP's Federal Policing Services in particular. The Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada, which is stewarded by the RCMP, develops reports regarding criminality in Canada, including on organized crime groups involved in aspects of the illicit cannabis market. These criminal groups and networks operate across Canada and are involved in all aspects of the cannabis distribution chain, including production, exportation, and trafficking. While much of the cannabis produced in Canada is for domestic consumption, it is also illegally exported around the world. These activities have the potential to provide large returns, with the funds used to fuel other illicit activities that organized crime groups are involved in, such as fraud, trafficking in firearms, and other illicit drugs. The RCMP is working closely with Canadian law enforcement community and government partners to establish regulatory regimes to help mitigate criminal involvement in the legal cannabis regime. Collaboration with the RCMP's law enforcement partners and other stakeholders will continue. From a frontline perspective, the RCMP provides policing services under contract to all provinces and territories in Canada, except Ontario and Quebec, and over 150 municipalities. The RCMP will also continue to work with partners and stakeholders in contract jurisdictions to ensure the continued safety and security of communities once cannabis is legalized, including in relation to drug-impaired driving. Crime prevention is a core element of the RCMP's mandate. In keeping with this, the RCMP continues to conduct outreach and awareness activities with Canadians, including with youth and Indigenous communities. Thank you again for inviting Superintendent Goupil and me here today to discuss the proposed Cannabis Act, including as it relates to organized crime. We would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Daly. Surintendant Goupil, voulez-vous ajouter quelques remarques?
Superintendent Goupil, do you have any remarks to add, or would you like to take questions? No, thank you. I do not have prepared remarks, but I would be happy to take questions if you're ready. I would therefore invite Senator Boisvenu, who is the committee's vice chair, to begin. Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senator Dupuis. Thank you. You seem so far from us today because the table is very long. Thank you for your very interesting presentations. Minister Goodale, when he appeared during hearings on Bill C-46, was asked by me how many RCMP positions had an evaluation officer associated with them 24/7. The department promised that information. Can someone from the department please make sure that we receive the information we requested? Because that will help us see how prepared the RCMP is to apply C-46. That's just a request to make sure that our previous request is followed up on and we receive the information. My question is to the RCMP or to public safety, I'm not sure. In the remarks from public safety, you said that you wish to stop organized crime from profiting from the legal market. We learned from the media that 40% of investment in production companies in Quebec, 40% of the investment comes from tax havens. So it is, quote unquote, illegal funding, but it hasn't been it hasn't had tax paid on it in Canada, and we know that profits will go back to those tax havens to ensure that organized crime cannot come in through the back door and infiltrate legal production. Does the RCMP plan to investigate the information that Quebec media have obtained, to wit, that 40% of producers, or that 40% of investment comes from tax havens? Superintendent Goupil? Thank you for your question. I did hear this as you did yesterday. I saw the report in the media that companies investing in Canada or companies who applied for cultivation permits are involved in tax havens. It is true that organized crime uses tax havens, but not all companies who use tax havens are criminal organizations. In the United States, for example, a number of people might register a company in a tax haven simply to conceal their identities for reasons of perception. You may, or one may wish to hide behind corporate confidentiality in order to invest in other companies. We've given examples of where that's done in the United States. There are, for example, teachers' unions who want the benefits of investing in a given company that produces cannabis, but wish not to be seen to do so for reasons of perception. There are, of course, organized crime organizations that will use tax havens or work through beneficial ownerships concealed behind the screen of corporate confidentiality to seek licenses to grow cannabis. But, Superintendent Goupil, we all know that tax havens are used by organized crime in Quebec for money laundering. So people who sell drugs illegally in Quebec will launder their money in tax havens, and that money is going to come back to Quebec into the legal cannabis industry. So here's my question. Once you know that this is hypothetically possible, does the RCMP intend to investigate companies that have received operating licenses and that may be funding operations through money that was illegally obtained? This is money that has avoided Canadian tax. Do you plan to conduct investigations who will fund legal pot with illegal money? Yes. Where there is any criminal activity, if there is information, if we obtain credible information, yes, of course, we will launch investigations, be it to check into money laundering or any other criminal activity. We do that already in other areas like cocaine trafficking and so on. We can also include economic crimes. So laundered money or the money that is obtained through crime, of course, we will investigate. Another question, Mr. Chairman, before we go on, and the floor goes to my colleague. The public safety representative said on page 13 that access to cannabis for illegal purposes should be limited. How can you make that statement when Bill C-45 is going to make it possible to own up to 5 grams of marijuana and to distribute up to 5 grams of marijuana? How can you reconcile those ends? Protecting children, but at the same time allow them to possess cannabis.
I think what the law attempts, or the proposed bill attempts to do, is to, yes, set a limit of 5 grams for possession for youth. And then I think in discussions that I've heard...
Mais on parle d'enfants de 12 à 17 ans, là.
But we're talking about children aged 12 to 17. How can you write that you want to prevent young people from using marijuana, and yet in the bill they'll be allowed to have up to 5 grams when they're only 12?
To allow the flexibility of provinces to bring that level down to 0. And I know there was great discussion yesterday in the committee about federal-provincial balance. And I think the best way to answer that question is that the criminal code and a bill such as the proposed Cannabis Act, we consider to be a very heavy hammer. And I think what we were trying to do is allow the provinces the ability to look at their jurisdictions and to be able to contribute to the existing or the proposed bill and to close that gap.
Merci, Sénateur Dupuis, suivi de Madame le Sénateur.
Thank you, Senator Dupuis, then Senator Eaton.
Yes.
The witness never did get to answer the first question by the senator. I wonder if he'd be allowed to answer the first question.
Yes, of course. Yes, Monsieur Bobsing, could you come back on the first question of Senator Boisvenu?
So the first question I think he had was a point of information, Chair, and so I've taken down the question that was asked of the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and Cyril, I will ensure through you, Chair, that that information is provided to the committee. On the second question, I believe, was around tax havens, and I really don't have other commentary around the commentary that my colleague from the RCMP provided, other than to say that there are a number of existing tools available to law enforcement, including the National Security Review, where the Canadian government can look at any organization that has a direct investment in Canada. And I think that would allow the RCMP to pursue investigations. There are a couple of other things that are happening that I think are important. The committee may or may not be aware of. There are discussions that Parliament is having in terms of looking at some of the financial implications for beneficial ownership, for example, that are being put forward that would allow some of I think some of the haziness or opaqueness and increase the level of transparency in terms of who actually owns some of these companies and where these foreign investments are coming from. So I know these discussions are happening, and we're hopeful that there will be improved tools around increased transparency for beneficial ownership. And then the last thing I would say is there is also, I think, an important aspect to tax havens that are mentioned in terms of a source where the international community is also making strides, I think, in facilitating the exchange of tax information. And I know that the Canada Revenue Agency is investigating the tax compliance of firms in offshore tax havens. And I know those are pretty detailed discussions that are happening. I am not a tax expert, but I would just suggest, Chair, that if you were interested in gaining more information, our colleagues from the Canada Revenue Agency or colleagues from Finance could speak to both those issues in greater detail.
Thank you, Mr. Bobsing. Madame le Sénateur Dupuis.
Merci,